Hi, I'm Phoebe Roberts. I am a college professor at various universities in the Boston area, and I just wanted to give some thoughts on the Freida McFadden novel, The HOUSEMAID, that I just read. So stories are the thing that I care most about in the world, basically, and nothing gets under my skin than something that I think did a lot of their storytelling well, but had fatal flaws in it that sort of robbed it of the power that it could have had. And I kind of had that experience with this book, The HOUSEMAID by Freida McFadden. And given that a huge part of my practice is figuring out what makes stories work and how to tell them well, I can't help but want to kind of pick this apart a little bit and put my finger on exactly where it came apart and what I think would have made it a little bit stronger. I picked up this book because it was recommended to me as being very much like, a gothic horror novel, only told in the modern day rather than set in the 19th century. And I was pretty intrigued by that premise, so I picked it up. And I would say that's a pretty accurate description of it. The basic premise is, the non-spoilery version of the premise is that there's this young woman who has just gotten out of a 10-year stint in prison. And she's in a desperate enough position that she accepts this job as housekeeper for this extremely rich family, even though there are all of these red flags in the house, including the fact that the wife seems not terribly mentally stable and is treating her really badly. And that really was enough to sell me on it, because you can tell that those are classic elements of, the gothic heroine's journey, where she goes into this house that has more secrets than she knows at first, and there's a hidden danger lurking, and she's going to have to unravel it and save herself from whatever horror is lurking. So I was into it. And there actually were quite a few things that I liked about it. If we are just going by plot structure alone, I thought it was really well built and well thought out. So spoilers, if you haven't read the book, warning for them here. We find out that even though the wife of the family is seemingly acting crazy and treating our heroine very badly, in fact, the husband is secretly deeply abusive to her, and she has brought this woman in an act of desperation to transfer the husband's attentions to the new housemaid so that he'll throw the wife out and allow her to escape from his mistreatment. And that I thought actually was an interesting twist on it. And I thought the writer actually made a lot of good choices about the circumstances in order to facilitate the plot that she was working with. Like, for example, the heroine had just gotten out of 10 years in prison after killing a man in defense of her friend and pleading to manslaughter. And she went in when she was 17, so she has spent a huge chunk of her formative years, imprisoned, which kind of explains, A, why she has a hard time finding another job, and therefore is more willing to put up with the terrible circumstances that she's put in by the wife in the housemaid job, because she's going to have a hard time, getting work anywhere else. But also, it explained why she was sort of vulnerable to the lies and fronts put up by the husband, who, as I mentioned, was, secretly abusing the wife. And to make to have a heroine that was naive enough to believe in, whatever he was selling her, I think it made sense for somebody who's, had probably some stunted growth because of losing so much time to prison. So I thought that was smart. Here's where it started to lose me, though. So I was on board with the idea that the wife brought in a housekeeper in hopes of sort of, as an act of desperation, getting her husband to fixate on this new woman rather than on her, so that she had some way to escape the abuse if there was somebody taking her place. And while that's an incredibly, indecent thing to do to another human being, I bought it as a character choice. And I also thought it made for an interesting journey for the wife character to have to recognize that that wasn't an okay way to get out of her situation, and that, she couldn't leave this woman to, just suffer to save herself. However, Yes, the book does make it very clear that it understands that the abusive man is the problem in this situation. It may be leading you for much of the story to think that, oh, it's just this crazy woman causing problems for this totally decent guy and treating this, innocent young housekeeper poorly. But it's eventually revealed to be sort of the desperate actions of an abused woman trying to get out of her horrible situation. So, good so far. But because the book understood this so well, it was leading me to hope that the wife and the housekeeper characters would come to the realization that they needed to help each other, to join forces, to enact some kind of female solidarity, as they were both victims of the same man and, by extension, the same, patriarchal systems that make women vulnerable to this sort of thing. And it never really got to that point. Instead, it has the wife sort of morph her plan from, oh, well, if he just fixates on the housekeeper and puts her in my place, I'll be able to get away, to, I know this woman has a criminal record and a history of reacting violently when her boundaries are crossed. So I'm hoping that if she's in the position to be violated like this, she will lash out and murder my husband. And yes, while the wife does come to the realization that that's not really an acceptable thing to do either, and comes back as if she's going to help the housekeeper in some way, by that point, the housekeeper has basically already murdered the man. The wife just comes back and finds out that the housekeeper has given him a taste of his own medicine by locking him in an upstairs closet and forcing him to, torture himself until he dies apparently of dehydration, which I'll give you was certainly shocking. But I never got that moment that I really wanted of the two of them coming together and realizing that through their commonality of experience, they could bond and that they could be stronger together against the man that had threatened them both. That seems so much more supportive of the theme to me of women suffering under patriarchy and fighting against the isolation and abuse that it can inflict on them. So I was quite disappointed with that. The most solidarity that they show to each other is that neither one rats the other out, which is something, I guess, but again, not very emotionally satisfying at all. And then the ending got even weirder when, there was this bizarre deus ex machina of, oh, it turns out the cop that's investigating, his kid used to be engaged to this horrible man too, by some coincidence, I guess. And he didn't know exactly what he did to her, but he knew that he hurt her somehow. So, he was just not going to say anything about the fact that they found the dude, locked in a closet from the outside, having pulled his teeth out and died of dehydration. Oh, and as a final little coup de grace, they made it clear in the epilogue that the husband was so screwed up because his mother abused him in similar ways as he was abusing his wives. So it's I guess, can't trust any women, huh? None of them are on your team. It's all their fault in the end. As I say to my students, and I try to use in my own work, you need to figure out what your character struggles with, the ways that they are weak, so that you can send them on a journey to be confronted on that weakness, so that they have to grow, so that they have to develop, they have to become a better version of themselves in order to achieve the goal that they have been going for. To have these two women who spend the entire story seeing each other either as their enemy or an expendable tool they can make use of, come together and see each other in a new light where they realize that they have more in common than they ever imagined and that they need each other and that they can save one another if they put those differences aside. Now that would be compelling. And I just don't think that it managed to get there by robbing us of that moment of connection. So ultimately, I thought it was an idea that had some serious potential, but was just really let down by its execution. And that's saying nothing of the writing style, the word choice. It was very much written like the author thinks that you're not very smart. And if everything's implications are not spelled out for you, often multiple times, you are not going to understand anything that's going on. I know one thing that reviewers called out a lot was, the classic horror movie trope of, oh, this door locks from the outside, but there are scratch marks on the inside. And it literally tells you that it's like somebody was trying to claw their way out because apparently you were born yesterday and you can't put two and two together that way. There was a bunch of stuff like that. Ultimately, I found myself wondering if it would have been better if it had just been set in the 19th century. I think certain things about it would have made a whole lot more sense. So outside of my teaching, you probably know I'm a dramatist. My main project these days has been a Victorian adventure show called Mrs. Hawking that I'd like to pitch to people as what if Sherlock Holmes were like a Lady Batman? There's a link in the description box if you want to watch it. So I have studied a fair bit about the 19th century in order to, write this world with some sense of atmosphere, to help the audience feel like they're, actually transported to a different kind of place. And I think we get a lot of these tropes from the cultural environment of that time. It would completely make sense in that setting to have a working class heroine who didn't have much access to education and was not very worldly because of it, and maybe was freshly out of jail because of an inability to navigate an extremely punitive legal system, and therefore did not have many options to get a good job. And if she managed to get a position in a nice house, she would hold to it by the skin of her teeth no matter how badly they treated her, because she would just have so few alternatives for a roof over her head and a way to not starve. And if you wanted a lady of the house who didn't have much power to save herself despite living ostensibly in privilege, that is very much a setting that would hold mental health over the heads of women and have a very easy time convincing people, if they behaved in an undesirable way, that they were actually insane, and put them away in these hellish mental institutions and keep them from their children and make it so that they would be destitute if they didn't comply with the, whatever the man of the house wanted. And it would be much easier to explain why this abusive man had such complete control over these women's lives. This would be a situation where, a man would be the king of his castle, and the lack of, infrastructure and communication methods would make it much easier to isolate and keep people's suffering in secret so that nobody would know about it. Or if they did, fewer people would care about it because it would be standard at the time for a man to make all the rules in his house and to punish people severely if they didn't comply with them. Now, would this book have been better if the story had been set in the 19th century like those classics? Not necessarily. I actually think that Freida McFadden did a pretty good job of making the scenario make sense. And God knows, abusive home situations exist. We have certainly not eliminated that as we have become more aware of it in the modern day. However, I do think that it is harder to justify in a modern context two women that you are supposed to sympathize with who never come to any understanding that they should be supporting each other against their common oppressor. If this was a genuine Gothic novel, you might be able to get away with it in that people might not have that understanding of gender solidarity across the classes. I definitely understand the problem of not wanting to write period characters with modern day sensibilities who sound like they've gone to college and gotten social studies degrees. But honestly, if I were the writer and I were writing it in that 19th century setting, I still think it would make it more compelling to have these two women realize that despite the huge disparity in their backgrounds, they had something deeper in common that could bring them together despite it, and to have them support each other through this, the worst crisis of their lives. That is an interesting growth path and a compelling story. I definitely would prefer that over cop deus ex machina and, oh, actually, it's mommy's fault. And those are my thoughts on Freida McFadden's The Housemaid. If you'd like to see more reactions from a college professor, like and subscribe. We'll talk about how stories work again sometime soon. Bye for now.